Hello and welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I'm Ramjee Chandran and today we are on episode 100 of season 2. 100 episodes seems like a milestone, some sort of achievement, but really it's just another number because there's so much more yet to come. So let's move it along. And we head back to the time after the failed Battle of Bangalore. The last episode was my brief introduction to Tipu Sultan, but the one before that we watched as the so-called Triple Alliance put together by the British collapsed before even a single shot had been fired. We then went to the Battle of Chengam, and that was the first formal engagement of the First Anglo-Mysore War. No one really won that battle, but the Anglo-Mysore War had found its character. A character, as we are about to see, was as much about pitched battle as it was about endurance and psychological warfare. But before I get there, as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, who make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. When the Battle of Chengam had reached its peak, it was very clear that Colonel Smith was winning it. He had occupied high ground. His guns had more reach, and he had thus neutralized Hyder's superior cavalry. But one part of Hyder's tactics, little discussed in history, was his attack on the enemy supply lines. He would dog an advancing army and order his cavalry to make lightning-quick sorties to plunder or at least disrupt their stores. It was a logistical nightmare for any army on the move. And then he would also conduct guerrilla-style attacks on unsuspecting army lines, causing a general nuisance to an army all prepped to fight a conventional battle. And this led to a rather interesting exchange of letters with the British, which I will cover in the next episode. But right now, at Chengam, Hyder was able to hit British baggage, which was what supply stocks were called back in the day. So, although Smith was winning Chengam without a doubt, he ran perilously low on supplies, and so he decided to withdraw to Tiruvannamalai to restock and resupply. But when he got there, the depots were empty. There was nothing. Muhammad Ali Walaja, the Nawab of Arcot, and the East India Company's principal client in the south, had assured the British that supplies would be waiting for Colonel Smith at Tiruvannamalai. But there was nothing waiting there for him. So, Smith first moved all the wounded and the sick to nearby places where they could get treated, and then he ordered his army to forage from surrounding villages. Their plan was to get some sustenance in hand and then dig in and wait for reinforcement, which would eventually arrive. But for now, it looked like Smith couldn't catch a break. He had been left stranded at the gates of the Bangalore and had to withdraw. He was winning at Chengam and had to withdraw to restock supplies. And then he was promised supplies at Tiruvannamalai by Walaja, but he was let down and had to forage from the villages. If Smith was sitting around in his tent wondering if things could get any more humiliating, he received the news that one of his officers, a Lieutenant Hitchcock, had deserted the army and was now a prisoner of Hyder. It didn't help that Smith was required to send a report to headquarters about this and the terrible effect it had on the morale of the army. And then, to make matters worse, when he requested Madras for permission to relocate the army to a more fertile area, he was refused permission. And the only reason given to him was he had to hold ground for political reasons. Smith was saved only because his soldiers found a large stock of grain buried underground by some local farmers. So they were able to sustain themselves in place. Eventually, a detachment led by a Colonel Wood joined forces with them on the 8th of September 1767, and now the combined British forces were restocked and battle-ready. But clearly not all that battle-ready if we read one letter about the condition of the army and the camp expressed in a report filed by Charles Raitt, who was the paymaster to the army, and it was dated the 21st of September, and it read, Every gentleman in camp is greatly distressed for both clothes and victuals. As for myself, I have hardly shirt or waistcoat to put on, and I believe there has not been such a thing as a bit of a biscuit or a drop of wine at any person's table in camp for this some days past, not even Colonel Smith's. Anyway, when Colonel Wood caught up with Colonel Smith, they got their act together. And military historians later questioned Hyder's decision to do nothing while Wood's forces caught up to Smith. But we will never know why. Nevertheless, on the 26th of September 1767, the two armies met again in battle. The Battle of Tiruvannamalai was larger and more violent than Chengam, and it produced one of the most extraordinary scenes in the history of 18th century Indian warfare. And I'd love to tell you about that, but now for a commercial break, and after that, one of the most absurd scenes that a battlefield in India has ever seen. It was the night of terror at Tiruvannamalai, and it would be horrific if it didn't also have a dose of humor. And that is coming up right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
The Nizam of Hyderabad, as was the custom inherited from the tradition of Persian armies, had brought his entire retinue of wives and concubines, his entire harem, to the battlefield. In a certain day and age, this was the custom and it was honored. But in what must be regarded as the beginning of modern warfare, it was a logistical complication in the middle of a military engagement, a nightmare of comedic proportions. So as the battle progressed, the British relied on their superior artillery, heavy and light cannon, and Hyder was planning counterattacks with cavalry. And we know from the previous episode that the Nizam's artillery consisted of outdated cannon, some of which simply would not fire. When the battle was well underway, as the British artillery began to find its range, much of the ordnance landed on the Nizam's troops, and they scattered in alarm. First, the Nizam's irregular troops, these being temporary soldiers rather than the trained standing army soldiers, started to waver. And then an order went out to turn the elephant train around. These were the elephants carrying the royal women. They were ordered to begin a retreat as it was getting too dangerous for these non-combatant women. And one would expect an orderly but brisk evacuation of the battle areas. But here, let's say protocol intervened in a manner that no military manual had anticipated. Put another way, one of the Nizam's wives decided at that point to pull a snit. She refused to allow her elephant to be turned around. When her retinue begged her to tell them why, she first said that she could not possibly move until the full hierarchy of senior wives had departed first, in strict order of precedence, so she would sit and wait until that happened. And then another excuse followed that she refused to let her elephant turn in the face of the enemy, claiming that her elephant had not been taught how to show its back to the enemy and would not run from the battlefield. Very brave, but whatever the real reason, the result was a traffic obstruction at the worst possible moment. A line of elephants carrying the Nizam's household blocking the retreat route while British cannonballs flew overhead. And then the Nizam's personal guard, seeing that their king was under cannon fire, panicked and decided that he should vacate the battlefield. Now when the Nizam himself turned to flee, the sight of the royal standard retreating triggered an immediate and total collapse of order. The entire Hyderabad army to a man, cavalry, infantry, artillery, the whole apparatus, decided to make a run for it. So chaotic was this retreat that in their flight at full speed, they selected the shortest route out of the battlefield, which happened to be right through the middle of Hyder Ali's camp, scattering the goats, the chickens, the cooks, and the dhobis. In the confusion, the Nizam himself galloped from the battlefield and reportedly never drew bridle, that is, pulled back on the reins of his horse, until he was safely through the Singarapete Pass, abandoning his wives and his concubines who trundled majestically on their elephants. 64 expensive Hyderabad guns, cannons were abandoned on the field. The road of the retreat of the soldiers was described by observers as a scene of absolute carnage. Dead horses and bullocks at every pace, abandoned treasure chests, overturned palanquins, and the most costly fortune of a royal household scattered along the mud. Hyder watched the Nizam's collapse with a mixture of contempt and professional alarm. His ally had just destroyed his own flank, spread panic through the rear, and handed the British a victory that the battlefield itself had not yet produced. Predictably, the Nizam's defection from Hyder Ali's fold followed within months. In February 1768, the Nizam of Hyderabad signed the Treaty of Masulipatam or Machilapatnam with the British, re-establishing his alliance with them, and he had to make several humiliating concessions. One of them included the formal recognition of British possession of the northern Sarkars, the one for which the Nizam was ready to go to battle. But for good measure, the treaty also named Hyder Ali as a usurper. What usurper means is that Hyder Ali had no rightful claim as ruler of Mysore, which meant that the British would be completely within their powers to wage war on Mysore for the absence of a legitimate ruler. But the truth of the matter, usurper or not, Hyder Ali was certainly not the first. He was a Dalabai who ruled Mysore. He did not make a claim to become the ruler, and he had allowed one of the warriors to continue as a king on the throne, even if that individual was king in name only. And Hyder Ali was not even the first Dalabai, as I said, he was the third, following the first two usurpers, if you'd like to call them that, Devarajaya and Nanjarajaya, the latter being Hyder's mentor. So when Hyder took over the reins of the kingdom, he brought a new spirit and a defiance of the British, which the British had not seen. So naming Hyder Ali as a usurper may not have been the entire truth, it wasn't an entire lie either, but it gave the British legal grounds to go forward with their plans. This, of course, was a diplomatic assassination, and Hyder Ali understood exactly what it meant, principally that he was now fighting alone. And his response was characteristic. He did not wait for the British to bring the war to him, he carried it to them. Now, this was a short interlude episode to set up the next episode, where we will see the attack on Bangalore and then how Hyder attacked Madras and won. And that episode follows this one immediately. Stay glued. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.